Good is Simple show. I'm your host, Chris Marlow, and I have a very good friend of mine, Andy Hooper, who will be joining us today. Andy, welcome to the show, brother.
Thanks, Chris. Excited to hang out, man.
Yeah, I'm excited to jump in and have a fun conversation about your life. You and your wife and your family are some of my favorite people. You guys run so hard, and yet one of the things you do is you just give back so much as well. Before we jump into some of the questions, I can't wait to ask Andy. Could be questions on soccer, politics, faith. This is going to get really fun because I gave Andy a few things to pay attention to, but I didn't give him all the things. But just
Beautiful.
a quick reminder, one of the things that we're doing is I wrote a book in 2015 called Doing Good is Simple. And it's interesting, whenever you write a book, you actually don't read your own book very much. It's a painful experience. But a few months ago, I just began to ask myself this question: is the book still relevant? Does it really matter? And so one of the things I wanted to encourage everyone today is Scripture reminds us of this very important thing. Galatians 6 just says this: do not get weary in doing good. And oftentimes, as the world seems like there's so much going on, if you open a social media app or a news media source, or even if you're talking to friends, much less the holidays with family, it can feel like everything is going wrong. And yet maybe there's actually some beauty and some hope and some joy in the world. And so this conversation, we're just going to tackle each chapter of the book and just ask these questions, because one of my hopes and dreams, and one of the reasons we started Help One Now, is that everyday normal people like us could help everyday normal people around the world live a better life and flourish. So one of the ways we do that in the Help One Now world is we talk about the circle of empowerment. The circle of empowerment is basically these partners, our local leaders. Last week, I talked about John and Orpa, our friends John and Lee, so many amazing leaders. And then the Help One Now team and board. And also folks like Andy and his wife for so long, our donors, our supporters, our advocates. We talk about this circle that if we all do our part, we can create a more beautiful, hopeful world. And so, Andy, one of the things I wanted to talk to you about is this quote that my buddy Greg Russinger had, and it became part of the ethos of Help One Now. And the quote was simply this: a life interrupted is a life inspired. And one of the concepts behind this is that maybe the life that we feel like we want to live, comfort and security, maybe that's actually not the best life. Maybe there's actually a more deeper, meaningful life. And that's when our life is interrupted. So, Andy, can you just do us a quick favor and just maybe give us a snapshot of who you are, your family, and kind of what you do on a professional level? And then we'll jump into some of the questions.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think interruption might be the subtitle of my life from that perspective. So yeah, my wife, Emily, and I have been supporters and cheerleaders for Help One Now, as you mentioned, Chris, since the first time that we took a trip to Haiti in 2013. Actually have been close to the organization since 2011, when we were moving back from Toronto, had been up there for a bit. Professionally, we had been up there because I was working for Burger King. Went to school at the University of Miami, got a job right out of college just after 9/11, during a time when getting a job was like impossible. And I felt so grateful just to have a job in human resources at Burger King, which was headquartered in Miami at the time. Had a chance to work there for the better part of a decade. A couple of those years, Emily and I got a chance to live in Toronto, moved back to Miami, and then ultimately went to go work and kind of have since in the restaurant space. Grew a brand based in Salt Lake City for a few years, lived in Park City. Life was interrupted there by 4 kids in 3 years.
Yes.
I always tell people that wasn't my plan, which is crazy. They're like,
That's
how do you
have
4 kids?
Us back. We're like, what happened to Andy? He disappeared. I'm kidding.
Everybody says, how do you have 4 kids by accident? And I say, well, we didn't. I number 1 and number 3 by accident, because my second and third are twin girls. And so, after that, we moved to Washington, D.C., which is where we live now. It sometimes feels like a long time ago, sometimes feels like very much yesterday. If you just think about and imagine, if you're familiar with life in the United States in 2018, sort of year 1.5 of Trump presidency number 1 is what brought us to Washington, D.C., to work on a pizza chain there. And then I spent the last couple of years working in a much more entrepreneurial capacity in the restaurant space. But my background, my love is restaurants, building and scaling restaurant brands, and right now working on a venture studio model that does that across multiple brands at the same time, with some well-known folks in Hollywood or music or whatever. So that's me.
So I'm a little jealous because you're hanging out where today?
I'm in Manhattan Beach today.
And I'm
Long
in
ways
Raleigh,
from
North
Washington,
Carolina.
D.C.
So I feel like you're winning the day, at least, Andy. You're winning the day.
I am winning the day. Yeah.
Awesome.
The people
All right,
are
so-
surfing 200 meters off the deck here. So it's
I
good.
grew up in California, and people ask me, hey, did you grow up surfing? And I'm like, do you see this body? Does it look like a body that's going to be surfing to you at all? So anyhow, no. Growing up in California, I never surfed, but love that spot. Andy, take us back a little bit to that trip to Haiti, because it was one of the first trips that, and it's kind of our connection is very unique. It was one of the first trips that I didn't lead for Help One Now. Like you literally, a mutual friend of ours, Nick, led that trip. And so I wasn't on it. And so it was one of these moments in Help One Now space where it's like, we're doing something around the world without me. And it felt great because I spent so much time in Haiti in 2 years. But like you and I didn't meet face to face for many, many years. And yet you and Emily were such deep supporters of Help One Now, why you're launching businesses, why you're launching kids into the world every 9 months for all the time it felt like. But
it was all the time.
Take us back to that first trip to Haiti and what that meant to you and Emily.
Yeah, I think so. We had just before that, when we left Burger King, Emily is an interior designer by trade, and we were working on starting a business. She was going to be importing home goods from around the world. And the thesis for that business was really that each individual piece of furniture or textile or anything else had a story behind it that was unique and interesting and one of one to the person who had made it. So we had the good fortune in the back half of 2011, when we began supporting Help One Now, to travel the world for her business. And we spent 6 months out of the United States traveling just about everywhere. It's like the dream. We like to sort of talk about the fact that we retired, in our early 20s and did that piece of our life up front before getting on with adulting. And, during that, one of the things that came up was how rich it is to see the world, like how important travel as an American outside of the country is for contextualizing all the things that you see and hear and talk about. And it was no different in Haiti. When we actually went with a couple of Emily's cousins too. So the four of us went on that trip in November of 2013.
Wow.
And it was a really important moment for us, because to get a chance to spend time with Pastor Sancier, with Pastor Jean Alix, with John Mondesir, Dario, and Nick leading the tour, and getting a chance to see Ferrier before Ferrier was Ferrier at the time, and hopping on a tiny little plane to fly to Cap Haitian, where the pilot's using a Garmin that's normally in a rental car to navigate. It's like
you literally watch it. You're in the air watching like this.
It's crazy.
You're like
on the dashboard. Yes.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that's most important about that is it sets you from a time and place perspective and a reminder of how vast this world is and how much of it you don't have to confront or see on a daily basis, and how easy it can be to just be overwhelmed by the idea that making an impact seems almost impossible. It's like everywhere you turn in Haiti in 2013, it was post-earthquake. You see tent city on the golf course. You see folks struggling to make ends meet, struggling to find the next meal. And it can be overwhelming. And yet at the same time, what you find in those spots is there's so much ingenuity, so much resourcefulness, so much creativity. I think in the book, right, Hatmaker did the foreword for your book, I think, right?
Yep.
And she talked about anytime rich and poor combine, we should listen to whoever has the least power in that scenario.
Yes.
And that really struck me being there, because the wisdom, the ingenuity, the resourcefulness, the resilience that you see and learn from is such a reminder that when you have, and the word privilege has gotten all sorts of twisted in the last however long, and now it's probably actually negative again all of a sudden. I don't know.
Yeah.
But truly, how privileged I am as an American to not have to even be that creative.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so, like obviously there's or selfless reasons for getting involved in supporting an organization like Help One Now, thinking about small ways to do good. But the selfish reason is it keeps you connected to innovation. I mean, like the kinds of creativity you see from folks in that environment is not something you see every day in your life as an American, because you don't have to. And so there's not the pressure that forces that kind of real innovation and entrepreneurship in the same way. And so I get inspired by that.
I love that. Speaking of that innovation, it's interesting when we bring our medical community around the world with us. You're talking to doctors, who now have such technology that they kind of follow. And when they're with us, one of the things they say all the time is like, "Oh, we love this." It's like back to the innovative way of solving problems that relied on yourself and not on technology. And it brings light and joy to see what is taking place. And I think that's one of the things about neighboring. We often just don't realize the power of being a neighbor and listening to others who aren't necessarily like us or have the same resources. And then we talk about this mutual connection, how we can learn so much from each other. So when we go on a Help One Now trip, and we'll talk about Ferrier in a second, the beauty of every trip that we have is not only is your heart broken, and your heart is also expanded, but you meet these amazing humans, and there's an intellectual connection that you don't realize you're going to get, because they're doing some of the most brilliant work that you can, imagine with the resource base. And you do walk away from an entrepreneurship or from an intellectual connection of realizing like these people poured into me as a human while I was with them, serving them, while they live in extreme poverty and kind of wild places. And it's one of our dreams. We talk about it all the time at Help One Now. We want both the person, the donor, the supporter, also their life being transformed. And that's when we talk about interruptions. If our life is interrupted, it may cause us to step back. And what we're seeing, Andy, and you may be seeing this in your space as well, folks are lonely right now. Folks are feeling like life. What are we chasing? We chasing just another paycheck. Like and on these trips, one of the things that you realize is like, is there anything more important than chasing deep, meaningful relationships with other human beings? And so I want to ask you, you and Emily are really busy. Since I've known you, you've kind of lived bi-coastal. You have, I know your schedule today and kind of what you're like, you literally are going like, you got an 18-hour day in front of you, crisscrossing LA, doing all kinds of things. And yet you guys are so intentional on giving back and doing good. Is there tell us the why with 4 kids and with multiple businesses, you could easily be like, hey, we have a lot going on and all of that's really significant, but yet you still are very intentional on giving back and doing good locally in DC where you live and also around the world. How did you do that and why is that important?
Yeah, I think number one, there's a commandment to that. And so there's the sort of altruistic component that's like, I'm trying to listen and be obedient in that way. But beyond that point, from a selfish standpoint, it, as I mentioned, it like helps me keep learning and stay curious about the world. I think one of the biggest risks and creators of that loneliness and everything else that you mentioned is when you become disinterested about the world around you. And as our friend Carl likes to say, and I'm a big proponent of, right? Like you become disinterested and stop being curious about things. Like that's the end at that point. And, one of the things I mentioned, like I was an HR leader by trade early in my career, as you know, and, the succession planning is a really important component to HR. And like staying connected to this is kind of like the way of succession planning too. It's like, you're trying to stay on top of what's happening and be close to the real world and not lose touch. And those human connections, when you strip away all the technology and the screens and everything else, and you're reminded of the fact that like generosity flows from these folks from who have very little to give. And I just think it's so important to stay close to that.
That's awesome. So I want to ask you a question because I know, and maybe this is kind of a part B to that question. Oftentimes when you talk about the word doing good, it feels like it's like nice or kind or of course. And one of the things that we know in the Help One Now world that's so beautiful is we have a really beautiful community, and they're all pretty highly driven, incredibly ambitious, building really fun, beautiful, amazing things. I mean, what they do is very impressive. Can you maybe speak, Andy, and maybe encourage the audience that you can be ambitious and also give back at the same time? How do you balance those two things? Because you're ambitious and you're also very focused on bringing light and hope into the world. And I think so many folks like you got to choose one or the other, that you can't have both. How do we get both?
Well, it's actually like, for me, it's actually very intellectual. Like, that sounds like an emotional question, but appealing to the emotion, I think, is obvious. So I'll appeal to the intellectual side of that a bit more and say, if you are ambitious, underneath that ambition is hope. It's sort of like the idea of like, why did we have children? Well, like, nobody in their right mind is going to have kids today if they don't think that the world can be better, 3-4 decades from now. If you don't, there's really no reason to, because why would you volunteer somebody against their will into an existence that you think is going to decline? And so, same thing with business. Like, why would you pursue something incredibly ambitious and audacious? Why would you try to build influence and reach and build a business to be millions or billions of dollars if you didn't think that the world was going to be better off in the future for that to do something with? And so I think hidden behind that ambition, if you sort of sit with yourself for a bit, has to be hope. And hope requires succession planning, back to the whole like HR look at things. And so, before I moved into the general leadership role that I have today, I was an HR person by trade. And one of my greatest responsibilities was making sure that I led talent acquisition and talent development. And so I think if you want to be ambitious, the height of what you can achieve is dependent upon how much good you can do in the world to build the foundation underneath what you're building. Because like, that's going to lift your work up. I mean, as you know, Chris, like, we're fortunate enough to have a space that we spend the summer at in Park City. And like, a very real world example of this is Park City has grown by leaps and bounds over the last decade. Vail bought Park City Mountain Resort. The whole town has exploded. What they're running into now is they don't have enough affordable housing.
Yeah.
And it's like, now everybody's like sitting there saying, like, what do we do? Like, we've built up this amazing space and there's nobody here who can afford to be here to experience it with us.
Wow.
And what will happen if that problem doesn't get solved is that it will shrink back down again. And the ambition for all of that will go away, because the lines will be long and the service will be terrible and the experience will be bad and the property values will go down. And all of a sudden you'll have the sort of boom and bust cycle that happens from time to time. Yeah. And life is like that. I encourage anybody out here who thinks that they're ambitious and thinks that they don't have time to look for ways to make that kind of investment back into the community. Is that, number one, that good is not complicated. It is simple, to your point. But you should be putting as much effort into bringing people along with you so that there's people to experience it with you. I mean, like, yes, there have to be nurses and second grade teachers and retail clerks and Uber drivers and all of these other things. And I think that mentality extends it's much further than just the United States. Like, we can't just be isolationist in thinking about how we solve for poverty, how we solve for lifting others up, how we solve for community. We have to have sort of a real sort of kingdom global mindset to that in order for us to really be able to lift up what we're ambitious about.
Yeah, I love that. I want to go back to Ferrier, because when we think about Ferrier, I remember Pastor John Leaks, who is, just one of the most amazing humans. If you've never been on a Help One Out trip, you got to go. And if you've never met John Leaks, he's just in the midst of some of the darkest moments, he is always full of joy and hope. And he's such a team builder.
Always,
right?
Always.
It's like, Pastor, you almost died yesterday. It's okay. God's going to take care of me. It's like, okay. I mean, really, these are true stories that we deal with on a consistent basis. It's wild. But I remember one day, John Leaks, we're in his office in just in the mountains of Port-au-Prince, Kinskoff. And he says, Chris, are you willing to work in a hard place? And I felt like I should say no. I'm already in Port-au-Prince, John Leaks. I don't know. I kind of thought this was hard. He's like, no, I want you to think about going to a place that I can't really get anyone else to go to. It's way up north. It's a desert. It's on the border of the Dominican Republic. But about 15 years ago, we sent out some people to start a church there, and they built this really beautiful community. It's in Ferrier. And so at the same time, a news reporter had been reaching out to me from Miami, talking about the trafficking taking place post Haiti earthquake. And the border crossing was right there in Ferrier into the Dominican Republic. And we won't get into all of kind of that chaos. But I remember driving 13 hours up to Ferrier, and it was a church and an empty field. And, think in 2 years when you went to visit it, we just kind of launched Ferrier, and you're thinking about, is doing good simple? Is the concept, is doing good simple? Now, if you go to Ferrier, even what's taking place in Haiti is one of the hardest countries to exist in. Literally right now, we have all kinds of chaos happening. Ferrier is this beacon of hope. We were able to rescue so many kids from trafficking. These kids are now growing up, flourishing. We have a preschool, a school, a high school, all the water project, families launching businesses. All of this hope is going on in Ferrier. And I remember watching this empty field, kind of having this moment of what I call a holy disruption. It was this moment where John Leaks was asking me to partner with him to be a part of this beautiful story. And it is an incredible, beautiful story. And that was a holy disruption for me. Saying yes to that, I knew would require a lot of work and a lot of sacrifice. So I guess, Andy, in two things, have you ever had a moment that you felt like was, back to my buddy Greg's, a life interrupted is a life inspired? When I think about, if I would have said no to doing something hard, I wouldn't have the joy of seeing the progress and the impact of Ferrier. So as I leaned into doing a harder thing, now I have so much more joy to pull back out from, if you will. So Andy, we'd love to hear from you. Have you ever had a moment of holy disruption that you kind of thought shook your life or your being, if you will?
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that comes to mind most is, so right around the time that we went to Haiti, actually now I'm thinking I'm trying to figure out whether I'm getting my dates sideways or not, but in right around that time, about a year prior, my wife's brother was killed by a drunk driver. He was on his bike and he was training for a triathlon, and it really sort of like tragedy can and did upend your life. And sort of the first thing that we did to kind of try to get our footing back in the universe was go the following November to Haiti, with Help One Now. And coming out of that, then the following year, in the spring, found out that in the spring of 2014, not long after Haiti, found out that we were going to have a kid. And life was so disrupted in every way then, because we went from like family being crushed to like confronting these sort of like big, issues of the universe firsthand and thinking about how do we make an impact, to then having a child and not planning on it. And honestly, like, it may seem totally ungrateful, but I think the mindset in our home at the time was like, why us? Like, why now? Like, why in the midst of all of this, God, would you give me something that I have to care for and care about and have hope for into the future? And so, yeah, that was a pretty disruptive moment for us. And then we ended up having 4 in 3 years, as I mentioned earlier, which was like extra disruptive for us. But it became this like altering experience of like, okay, I have to believe that the future here on earth is going to be better for folks. Like, I have to believe that I can create goodness here, because now I've got all of these humans that are responsible for, I'm responsible for like putting in that place and teaching to be good citizens and good humans and to further that belief. And I think it was inspiring, and it is inspiring. It has altered the way that I choose to prioritize my life, even though I'm spending an 18-hour day here in LA, as you mentioned. I'm coaching 4 kids' baseball teams and softball teams in the spring, and doing drop off and breakfast every day when I'm in town. And those small things are part of that moment of disruption, and have candidly like affected how we think about raising them and their closeness to this relationship that we have with Help One Now and with the world generally for them to see things. So I think much like you talked about, that experience and that disruption of my life has given me joy to lean into hard things because of what I know is on the other side, which is this like incredible richness and purpose and hope at the end of the day.
I love that, Andy. And I think, one of our missions at Help One Now is what we call a family empowerment program. It's just absolutely critical to see families thrive and flourish around the world. We do that through helping kids go to school and helping families launch businesses so they can provide for themselves and their kid, among other things. Andy, when I think of you and Emily, I feel like, we want to see families thrive around the world and developing countries that we serve in. We also want to see families thrive here from our supporters, our friends, our neighbors. I mean, a healthy family is so critical to a healthy community and to having hope for the future. Can you maybe just share real quick how you and Emily have been able to, like, what feels like in my case, sync up and have like a very driven, I mean, y'all are on multiple boards. You guys do a lot. And it feels like it's a unified front in how you tackle that. How does that work out practically? I know there's some people watching trying to figure out, like, how do I get my family clicking to do this together so we can create family health and also impact around the world?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure I have the answer for everybody, but I can tell you what works for us, which is sort of that, it sort of starts with like, does this help the two of us together as partners? Then it's like, does this support the family overall? And then it's like, okay, well, what do you guys each want to do? And like, there's some agency and some freedom there, but it's all laddered up to the fact that like, if Emily and I aren't strong and on the same page, then like there's going to be issues that are downstream. I think one of the things we've done is, made a deliberate decision as a family to live in a place where we cannot sort of just be totally comfortable as a family. Now, I don't mean to say that we are not like blessed beyond compare and safe in our own walls and everything else, because we are, but I mean, we live on the southeast side of Capitol Hill in Washington, DC. It is not for everyone. And yet it is for us and for our family because it helps them have to confront as much, I think, as you can possibly get of what America is in, 10 blocks on a day in and day out basis. And look, I think that's tricky because you want to prioritize safety and educational quality for your kids. And, the choice that we've made for our family is not necessarily the same choice that somebody would make for theirs. And there's probably plenty of similarly situated people, listening in who are like, you guys are crazy or you're reckless about that or whatever. But no, it's very intentional because I think raising well-adjusted children who are pushing for innovation and good and entrepreneurship and new and hope and all these other things requires that they be grounded in genuine empathy. Like they need to know. And so, my kids go to school with kids in Section 8 housing. They go to school with kids who are older and younger than them in the same grade because there's been learning loss or gaps or whatever. And the amount of finesse that they're able to show in the world at a young age is 100% directly as a result of that.
Yeah. I remember my youngest daughter coming home from school one day and she was really hungry. And I'm like, why are you so hungry today? I think she was maybe 10 at the time. And, she's a pretty quiet kid and I had to kind of force it out of her, if you will. I'm like, why are you this hungry? And she's like, well, one of my friends at school lives in the homeless shelter and didn't have food today. So
I'll do it for you.
Yeah. I do it. Right. Like that's like to see the grit and the grime and so like I gave my food to her so she could eat. And so I know from a father perspective, you're like, these are the moments where I want my kid to like know this exists and also to be generous. And because, my child's never had that scenario ever. And so just to be able to give food and help. And I know sometimes as fathers, we want to create safety and security and remove ourselves from the grit of life. And yet it's so important to actually lean into it, because that is society. That is, but that's also the kingdom of God. We have brothers and sisters who live in so many different environments, and we get to participate kind of in that. And so thank you. Andy, help me understand this. Like, you literally could be living in Park City and you're choosing to live in the south side of DC. And I just like, how many times do you doubt your own choices and say, maybe I should stop doing the harder thing and just go back to the easy?
Routinely, if I'm being honest. But also, Emily and I look at each other and talk and say, do we still think this is the right thing? Over the last 4 years in particular, it's been wild living in DC during COVID with everything being locked down, running a business based in DC during the summer of 2020 after George Floyd. There's just a lot of moments in there where it's easy to be like, is this right? Like, should I be here? Like, am I like thinking too highly of myself, that I'm too capable? And every time we end up coming back to, no, this is right for right now. And I think it's a lot like, I think one of the core tenets around doing good and it being simple, it's not that it's not difficult or hard or emotionally intense, but that it's actually broken down. It's like, just do the next best thing. Like, take one step. It doesn't, trying to imagine how to do all of these things all at once and solve all of it is what creates the paralysis. But doing just the next best thing, saying like, okay, well, we're okay today. Like, let's see how it works through the weekend. And like, let's see how it works at the end of next week. And then let's see how it works at the end of the quarter. And I think that's really the key, is continuing to just break that down into bite-sized, moment by moment sort of revisiting. And I can't do that effectively if I'm not staying connected to the world, because like, it's just easy to start coasting, and coasting is dangerous.
Coasting is so dangerous, and it's so sad, because it's actually what creates a lack of connection to the universe, to humanity. And I want to, man, I wish we had more time for this. I want to dig into that, because one of the things I often see in very successful, ambitious people is they become so successful, they build their own kingdoms and they remove God and faith. It's not that they don't believe in God. They just kind of remove the need for God on a daily basis. And it feels like one of the things you're saying, Andy, is like, no matter how successful I am, or like the intellectual connections or the people I know around America, living this kind of life requires a daily faith in something bigger than myself. Is that true?
Yeah. I mean, you have to believe that you're not God in order for it to make sense. Absolutely.
Okay. So last question. And it's a tricky one, because, who wants to talk about politics these days? It gets so wild. We're about 6 months into President Trump's second go around, if you will. And you live in the heart of like this political intensity. I know we talk all the time. You literally do life with people on both sides of the aisle. And when I say life, like,
it's true.
Kids are playing soccer, going to school together, eating at a restaurant. I mean, you're in it. If we can like take a step up from politics, talk about the humanity side of it, what would you tell America, maybe the 4 people or 4 million watchers, who knows, how do we think about politics, and what would you recommend a way forward? Because it feels like, to me, one of the challenges that I see is, and this, I mean, I think we all feel this. We know we're going to disagree on policy, but it feels so intense that we almost hate each other now. And how do you live in a country where maybe 2 sides hate each other, and we're creating fear and chaos and pain? And to move forward, it feels like we're going to have to find a way to work together to move forward. Do you have any way to guide us, as someone who lives in this space on an everyday basis, on how we can practically pursue that kind of hope in the future?
Oh, yeah. I probably have two things, but they're both related. The first is actually quite similar to the idea of why going and visiting with local leaders in Help One Now brings you into a level of connection with them that inspires your ongoing relationship with them. And that is travel, like travel outside of your world. I mean, it doesn't take long to gain empathy if you are genuinely curious. If you go drive through Charleston, West Virginia, past coal plants and communities that are built up along the river, to understand why, like, abrupt shifts in energy consumption and production in America might be really problematic for that community.
Sure.
It doesn't take long if you live on the south side of Capitol Hill and go to school to see like what real issues might be facing Americans today and why social programs might be necessary and not a complete waste or fraud everywhere all the time.
Yeah.
And so, I think that traveling creates like real genuine empathy. It's tough because W. Kamau Bell did that with a show for a bit where he like went down and met with the KKK in Alabama as a black man to like better understand what's going on. And it's like curiosity is such an important piece about building a bridge there, which is just a little bit different than being judgmental. But I think the other wish that I have is what you said at the beginning, which is humanity. And I guess I'll tell this story. My oldest celebrated his 10th birthday earlier this month. It's actually in the fall, but we had to, because of life, figure out a way to celebrate him properly that worked amidst the schedule of everything. And we ended up doing this in early February. So like a couple weeks after inauguration. There were 9 other boys that joined him in celebration of his birthday. And in early February, of those 9 other boys, half of them had parents who had been fired in the last week. And a couple of them had 2 parents who had been fired.
Yep. And
in some cases, those people didn't know if they were fired because they didn't know if the Supreme Court was going to block it or not or whatever.
Yep.
And my plea to America is that 2 things can be true at the same time. There can be things that we can do more effectively than are being done today. I think that's obvious. And on the other end of those are people, many of whom who are doing real work. In one case, actually, one of these folks is a USAID employee.
Yep.
And as a nonprofit who works in other parts of the world alongside USAID, you guys have a front row seat to the inefficiency and corruption and other things that exist in that organization, which is also true. Yep. But there's humans on the other side of that. And so I just wish that in the world today, we would all just take a step back and lead with some humanity and remember that regardless of whether there's an opportunity for something to be more efficient, to be broken in order to be rebuilt, this is not a piece of software as a service. These are humans. And so you can't break humans and rebuild them with the same level of clinical efficiency that you can break a software subscription down and rebuild it with a level of efficiency. And I think that's, for me, my earnest prayer is let's have some humanity.
I love it. It's a reminder. And I think this is what gives me incredible faith for the future, faith in God, faith in humanity, is Jesus always challenges us to do 2 main things, 2 main commandments: to love God and to love your neighbor. And in Scripture, your neighbor wasn't someone that you actually cared about all the time. Your neighbor, it wasn't actual, even a physical neighbor. It was a concept to just find a way to love the other person. And then the extension of that conversation even goes, love your enemy. And I think about when we live in a world where God calls us to love him, to love our neighbor, and to also love our enemy. How do we live that out in reality? And Andy, I know you're trying to figure that out every day with the nonprofits you serve, the way you and Emily give back, the places that you live. So I want to thank you for being a part of the show. Thank you for being
thanks for having me, Chris.
Help One Now donor. Thank you for being a board chair of Help One Now. You've led this organization so well in such crazy times. But more than anything else, man, thank you for just living a beautiful life and trying to work through kind of, what a lot of people don't like. It's the not the extreme side, but it's the messy middle where we're trying to figure out how to make the world better and do it in a way that we can feel good about, even when we have to make hard decisions. And so I want to thank everyone for being here, for watching the show. Andy, thank you for being on the show. Next week, I'm excited to have Caitlin, and she's going to talk about a lot of fun things. So tune in, 12:30 Eastern, 11:30 Central, and I can't remember all the times at this point. I've obviously messed that up. But Andy, thank you for being here, brother. Appreciate you, and enjoy
Thanks, Chris.
Manhattan Beach tonight.
I appreciate it.